This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. An orphanage in Mexico with deep ties to Missouri operated for 58 years. The website for Niños de México showed photos of smiling children and staff, house parents, social workers, doctors, all working alongside volunteers on mission trips. Paying for all of this was a network of donor churches in Missouri and other states. The orphanage was operated by a charity based in Franklin County, and its executive director, Steve Ross, found support and funds all over the country.
We've been working hard with several governmental organizations to increase our effectiveness in transforming the lives of the children in our care, as well as providing even greater safety to every one of them. Through your support, you are providing that care in the lives of these vulnerable children.
That was Niños Executive Director Steve Ross speaking in March 2023 in a recorded message addressed to a congregation in Oregon, one of its many donor churches. 2 months ago, everything changed. Niños closed its doors and deleted most of its website. The decision came immediately after an independent investigation revealed numerous accounts of child sexual abuse laid out in over 250 pages. The cases stretched from the present back into the past over decades and involved multiple alleged perpetrators that included the founders of the orphanage itself. The closure of Niños in November of 2025 came after years of effort by former supporters who became whistleblowers, both in America and Mexico. Many are now continuing to speak out in support of the victims and demanding justice. Last week, producer Danny Wicentowski sat down with two of those whistleblowers, Julie Heifner and Eric Miller. I should note that their conversation includes a description of sexual assault. Eric Miller was 16 when he first visited Niños after winning a drawing held through his church. Danny began the interview by asking Eric to describe his first impression of the orphanage as a teen volunteer.
They told us that it was a week-long trip to a home for orphaned, abandoned, and abused children. Within the evangelical Christian church, short-term mission trips are very common, very popular. I had done something like this the year before to Chicago, going up from Champaign where I lived. And I was excited. I was excited about the opportunity to get to know the kids. We were told that we would be working on the houses, and that for those of us who, were interested in ministry, which I was, this would be a good opportunity to get our feet wet.
And Julie, what was it that drew you to Niños when you discovered it?
I was introduced to the ministry through the Christian church that I attended at the time. And at the time, I was a professor, and one of my specialty areas is intercultural communication and behavior. So when I heard about the ministry, it piqued my interest. And our church was financially supporting, but they had never sent anyone to visit the mission field. And I said, "Send me, I'll go." And so the church was like, "Okay, we've never had anybody actually go." And I said, "I'll do it." So they sent me, and my son, who was attending college at the time, he and I met up there and attended a short-term, week-long mission trip on the property.
What was that first week of impression like? What was this place, and what was, I guess, the actual work of support being done there?
It was impossible to be around the children and not have your heart be overwhelmed with wanting to be near them. I think what struck me was just the desire to help and to serve. And at the time, I was an empty nester very early in life. And, it was a way that I could kind of combine passions, with what I did as a professor and a need that was there. And I kind of felt a calling. So I was hooked. I tell people that I left my heart there, and I hoped that God would allow me to come back and collect it. I got introduced to their homes and the children, and that was it for me. I fell in love with the children and was like, okay, I've got to be a part of this mission field somehow.
Eric, talk to me a bit about that. What was it that, touched your heart? Were there any children where at the end of your short, mission trip, you were like, I have to go back and see them?
Well, there were many children, and I think about the experience that a friend told me when she realized that how much she loved Niños. And she was working in one of the houses, and she said she heard the sound of children laughing and playing outside the window. And I think that was also my experience as well. When you think about an orphanage, you're not going to think of something like Niños. Niños is absolutely a beautiful property, and certainly on the surface, the children seemed to be happy. They were laughing, they were smiling, and there were a number of little boys that we played soccer with in one of the houses, in the house that was called Agape. And if you look through my pictures of Niños, you will see me with one of those little boys, and we have a Spanish-English dictionary open, and we're going through the words. He's teaching me Spanish, and I was teaching him English. And it was those kinds of experiences I had with numerous of the children over the course of that week that really, made me fall in love with Niños.
You both spend years with Niños as supporters, as volunteers, an intern, working with your own professional skills. And I understand that there are numerous churches that, in Missouri, across the country, that would support Niños. Eric, could you tell me a bit about the shape of this support? How far did this network go, and were you involved in that kind of outreach and pushing that even further?
So Niños tapped into something that is really powerful, and as Julie talked about, and that was the children and the making it possible for supporters to interact directly with the children. So if I support a mission, for example, in Liberia, the chances that I'm going to be able to go to Liberia and see the kid that I might have a picture of on my refrigerator are very slim. But in the summers at Niños, church after church after church every week would go down, and they would get to see the kids, they would get to see the homes, they get to play games, eat food, go to one of the churches, and this is an incredible draw. So what kind of work are 16-year-old kids really doing down at a children's home for a week? Not really much. We were painting walls that had probably been painted 30 times previous, but this allowed the institution to expose the ministry to potential supporters. It's what kept people coming back, and it's also what got more and more churches involved.
Now, this ministry, Niños itself, it's been around since the 60s. It's a very long time. I would imagine that brings with it a certain kind of trust, a certain kind of integrity. Did this place seem like the right kind of orphanage, or a place that if you're going to trust any place, a place that's been around for 50 or 60 years, did that factor into your confidence in what they were doing?
Absolutely. And that was something that, when I was there during the second time I lived there, I experienced their 50-year celebration, which was just a party among all parties to see the previous generations come back and celebrate. And, it felt so good to be part of something so celebratory and on the surface looking so successful and beautiful and like a part of a legacy. So, yes, it was for me very humbling to be able to be part of something like that. And I think that gave them a lot of credibility for people that continued to support the ministry.
Was that the same with you, Eric? Did that history give it a sense of trust for you?
Yeah, absolutely. My great aunt supported Niños. I never met her, but generations before, she had been a strong supporter of the ministry. And I think, as Julie said, this idea that you're part of a legacy that stretches back decades. They make a big deal about the fact that alumni came back to work at the institution. All of this factors into the credibility of the institution.
Now, we've been talking about a lot of the beautiful things that you experienced at this place and with these children. But obviously, we are here because there were not beautiful things. They were terrible, evil, even things. And not just against one person, but against 20 employees of that organization. Going back, as the report found, to the very founders of Niños. You both have had distinct experiences with observing this abuse and attempting to report it. Julie, I want to ask you about this because you faced both of these scenarios of being abused and then also confronting the institution of Niños and realizing that when it came to child abuse, things were not as trustworthy, were not as honest as you perhaps had hoped. This happened early in your experience with Niños. Can you tell us a bit about what did happen and what you did after?
Sure. I unfortunately was introduced to the organization's medical doctor, Dr. Noé Flores. And during my first time living there, he was introduced to me by the executive director. And it was explained to me that he was in charge of taking care of all of the children in the organization and any of the employees and guests that came to the property and needed medical care. So he was in charge of all of the medical care that I personally received during my time there. And I was sick quite a bit during that first stint. And at first, I liked him, was very comfortable with him. And I look back now and I realize that it was a grooming process that was very purposeful, very intentional on his part to get me to be comfortable with him, to make me let my guard down around him. And so we kind of built up this relationship because obviously I had to seek his services pretty frequently. And on this particular day that I went to get medical services from him, I went by myself. I went for a sinus infection. And during our medical exam, everything was fine. And he was explaining what he was doing. He was focused on my sinus cavities and then moved down to my neck. And then all of a sudden he stopped speaking to me and moved to a part of my body that I will mention. I would have made an appointment with a specialist had I had questions or needed care for. I would not have sought a primary care doctor to attend to that part of my body. And I will also address that there was no explanation given for the change in direction of the information or the exam. There was no consent given by me. There was no, there was nothing on my part that indicated that I had any understanding or I gave any consent to him for what occurred after that. He stopped speaking. He was completely silent. He touched a private area of my body that was completely inappropriate and began to sexually assault me. It was like he just shifted. It was like there were two different people in that examination room with me. And then he started speaking again to me and gave me my paperwork and told me the exam was over. I believe that there are many, many victims of him. The organization was aware.
Flores, this physician, he's mentioned in the report for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment called GRACE. That is the nonprofit that conducted this independent investigation. And how terrible that you went through that experience and that this doctor abused many others, as this report found. Eric, you were at Niños around the same time as Julie here. You had your own experience of discovery where you began to receive your own reports, your own concerns that people were bringing to you, and you were trying to bring those to the people up on the higher levels of this institution, people who should be exercising that trust and integrity. You found something very different, though, as you began to raise the alarm. What was your experience in that attempt?
Yeah, so 2015 was the first time I heard about a house parent abusing a child. My understanding was that that house parent had been dismissed, but it puts a thought in your mind. A little bit later, I had heard that a house parent had had an inappropriate contact with a girl in his home, and then that he had been moved, and that this had been done not just with the knowledge of the executive director, but with his express will. That was what he wanted done. After that, I was informed by a young man at the institution that a house mother had had a sexual relationship with a child who was a minor at the institution, and that relationship had continued up to the present day. I took that information and immediately went to the executive director of that ministry, of Niños. I was there in 2018 at that time for an internship. I spent my entire summer working on that, trying to gather information, because the initial contact that I had with the executive director about that claim made it clear that he didn't believe it and that he wasn't going to act on it. Now, at the end of that summer, it got to a point where I thought that he believed me and that he was going to do something about it. And before I left, I had heard that that house mother had been relieved of her duties. But the experience that I went through to get to that point completely evacuated me of any confidence of the ministry's ability to be able to handle these kinds of things. Perhaps the final straw before the final straw was when one of the young men that I supported at the institution told me that he had been sexually assaulted, sexually abused during his time at the institution. Again, I went to the executive director and confronted him about it, and what he told me was, "I don't recall, and I think that I would recall." Finally, in 2022, I was introduced to a woman who had been a former employee of the institution, who was actively speaking out against abuse that she had heard at Niños. When I got connected with her and heard her story of information being given to the executive director about abuse, and that information not being given to authorities, which allowed the abuse to continue, and compared that story with little things that I had heard over the course of the years, I realized that we were not dealing with isolated incidents. We were dealing with a systemic pattern of abuse and non-disclosure, and that's when I decided to speak out.
That was Eric Miller and Julie Heifner, former volunteers and supporters of the Niños de México orphanage. Niños closed abruptly in November last year after an independent report documented numerous cases of child abuse. We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. We're spending today's entire show exploring the downfall of the Niños de México orphanage, which closed late last year after an outside investigation documented decades of abuse. The orphanage was based in Mexico City and was operated for more than 50 years by Missouri Charity and its network of donor churches. Some of the orphanage's former supporters aided that investigation and have become whistleblowers. That's what happened with Eric Miller and Julie Heifner. Last week, they sat down with St. Louis on the Air producer Danny Wicentowski. Before the break, we heard Eric and Julie describe how they learned about multiple cases of sexual abuse and their attempts to raise the alarm with the executive director of the orphanage. Let's return to their conversation with producer Danny Wicentowski.
Julie, this executive director that Eric mentioned, Steve Ross, who is a name that comes up a great deal in the Grace Report, he is the person in charge. And as it turns out, he's also the person who received many reports of abuse, including from both of you. Julie, can you talk to us about your attempts to raise the alarm? And you yourself reached a breaking point in 2019 and left. What was that breaking point for you, and what did you see from the way that Steve Ross responded to your concerns?
Sure. So I served as a spiritual development coordinator / director, and I also was on the leadership team. And part of my role on the leadership team was the heads of each department, like education, spiritual, the psychology team. We were on that team, and so we received a lot of information along with the field director, the executive director. We would meet weekly about disciplinary issues in the house, educational issues. We were the team that really dealt with all of that sensitive information. So in my role, I received a lot of very sensitive information about the children. So I had a lot of knowledge of the inner workings of things that were going on in the homes, not just from those team meetings, but because I was in the homes. Every week, I was working with the children consistently. I had very close relationships with the children, and a lot of the information that I received directly from Steve Ross. I received directly from David Hernandez, who was the field director during my time. And I can only speak to the leadership team that I was under, which were the two of them as the executive director and the field director. So I was involved. And I was specifically asked in one situation that Eric referenced to go in and to talk to some of the girls that a male house parent allegedly abused several girls in one of our homes. And I was asked by them to go in and interview the girls. And I was also asked by the field director, along with the entire team, to lie and concoct false reports, which I refused to do. And I actually walked out of that meeting, and I received a phone call from the United States. Steve Ross was in the United States at the time. And I only knew about that abuse because Steve Ross had previously disclosed that to me without the field director's knowledge. So they hadn't discussed that, but I had that knowledge going into that meeting. So when the field director presented that to the team and said they had no prior knowledge of any of that information, I said, that is not true. You all had that information. You knew about that situation. You did not advocate for those girls, and which, of course, he didn't appreciate. And when we were asked to concoct chronology, which was years prior to my arrival, and I will point out that most of the members on that leadership team were not in employment, had no affiliation with the ministry at the time. And I said, I will not lie for you and I will not concoct, because they were being called on the carpet by a governing agency to provide documentation. And so most of the knowledge that I have of the 6 different perpetrators and situations came directly from leadership. So
the fact that this information was clearly being circulated and among the people who should have been acting, this ends up covering a great deal of material in this report that it was released at the end of last year by Grace. Again, that's a nonprofit that stands for Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. And to cover, some of the developments that happened between both of your involvement in Niños and now this report, there was law enforcement involved in Mexico in investigating at least one perpetrator, a man named Javier Colozia. And there was a great deal, it sounds like, of people talking about this abuse in Mexico in their own languages and spreading this information as a way to try to get something done when it clearly wasn't happening from the American side. Eric, in January of 23, you begin writing about these cases on a blog, and it's not long after that that both of you begin talking to media, and that is when this Grace report, this organization, comes in. And I understand that your records, the things that you retained, the reports, these become part of the backbone of this 250-plus page, really heart-wrenching, sickening document of what is almost a half century of abuse. Could you talk to us a bit about what it was like to disclose this to this outside organization, to trust someone else to do the right thing, and what your reaction was to finally see that report in print? Eric.
Yeah, so we were pushing for an investigation, an independent investigation. So when I started this, what I tried to do was have concrete goals, things that I could actually achieve. The first was an independent investigation. The second was the removal of everyone abused and those who had the legal responsibility to report abuse and didn't do so. And the third was some kind of restitution to be made for the victims. So we fought like hell for a year to get an independent investigation. That's when these first media stories came out, when I started speaking out, doing Facebook Lives, started writing on my blog, contacting churches. That was all aimed to get an independent investigation. So when Grace came in, it really felt like a respite in many ways because we were doing the groundwork of investigating, and here are actual experts who are now going to pick it up and take it. So we were happy to turn this over to somebody who could actually put this in a report and then make that actionable so churches could do something about it.
And Julie, what was this like for you to work with this organization and to have your findings become part of their report?
Respite, release, a celebration that, I knew from working there and the things that I had reported directly to leadership during my tenure there that I was just one piece of the puzzle. Eric was one piece of the puzzle. And I knew that if Grace came in, they were going to be able to represent the collective body. And I do want to point out that there were many, many, many advocates that came before us and many that came after us and many that were there at the same time I was. And when they came in to do this, there was so much that I learned in that report about what leadership knew, when they knew it, how many other people were reporting at the same time I was, victims, other employees, people in the community, other people in the churches. Like, when you see it in its totality, it's shocking. When I looked at that and I thought, number one, I learned just so much about, people that I didn't know that I was still in contact with were identified as perpetrators and abusers and, people I would have never guessed. And then other people that stepped up and participated and had information that I had no idea had information. It felt so personal when I was there. It felt so just retaliatory to watch, like, the abuse unleashed on the adults, the employees, and the people who were whistleblowing and advocates for the children. And, it just wrecked me. It wrecked me in so many ways. And to see all of that come together in a body of work. And I do want to say that I believe there are so many more victims than even that body of work represented. And so many people that chose not to speak for whatever reason. And, I hope that at some point that they come forward, but I respect their right to walk out their journey in whatever way they choose to. But I think Grace did a beautiful job of collectively bringing those stories and putting them together so we could see. I was horrified to see how far back it went, to see how deep it went, and just, levels and levels and levels of grief and sorrow.
When I was reading the Post-Dispatch report about this, it reported that this Grace report, that is, this investigation conducted by this outside nonprofit, that only happened after there was pressure from the donor churches, from this community that I think both of you came from. Eric, could you talk about that? What was that pressure? Was it these church communities finally saying, we don't want rosy updates, we want the truth about this?
Yeah, so initially, the board of directors, when I started speaking out, after a couple of months, contacted me and said, they wanted to talk about an independent investigation, that they wanted to move forward with an independent investigation. So I had a meeting with them. As far as I was concerned, the meeting went very well, and they were on board and they were ready to do an investigation. A couple of weeks later, I get an email from them saying, "We're not going to do it. Thank you for your time." That's a quote. "Thank you for your time." I said, "This is not over. It's not even close to being over. What are we going to do next?" So I scoured the internet for church after church after church after church in my community that supported Niños. I created a document that was very similar to the initial document that I had sent to the board of directors of the institution, outlining a number of different cases, changing names and things to protect the identity of the children and so forth. And I sent that to approximately 50, maybe 55 churches with an offer to talk and have conversations. And as more testimonies came in from the children and others talking about abuse, or employees talking about trying to report abuse and being stonewalled, I would send that information to the churches. And that drip over the course of months and months and months, churches started to drop off here and started to drop off there. And it really came to a head when, in the summer of 2025, the Mexican government came in and removed most of the children.
That was Eric Miller and Julie Heifner. Both spent years as supporters of the Niños de México orphanage. Niños closed 2 months ago after an investigation documented numerous cases of child abuse. We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. I'm Elaine Cha. Let's return to our conversation about the Niños de México orphanage. Niños closed in November after numerous accounts of sexual abuse were documented in an independent investigation. That investigation followed news coverage by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 2023, and after that, pressure from supporters and donor churches. Niños commissioned the investigation, which was conducted by the nonprofit GRACE, an acronym for Godly Response to Abuse in a Christian Environment. The report documented more than a dozen perpetrators of abuse against the orphanage's children. The report's findings drew on information provided by former volunteers like Eric Miller and Julie Heifner. Last week, the two whistleblowers sat down with producer Danny Wysentowski. Before the break, Eric and Julie talked about the GRACE report and about their attempts to report abuse to Niños' executive director, Steve Ross. Let's return to that conversation. Here's Danny.
We began talking a bit about the draw of Niños to church communities and to people, young and professional at kind of every age of life who wanted to work with children, to do some good, to go to a place that inspired you. And I bring this up because when I was looking for more information on Steve Ross, I found a kind of an audio postcard, let's say, a message that he had made for a church in Oregon in 2023. What struck me so much is that he is saying these things at a moment where these abuse cases are about to destroy this entire orphanage. But this is how he conveys an update in 2023.
Dear friends of Roseburg Christian Church, thank you for your partnership that is changing lives here in Mexico. Your giving allowed over 100 young people to be impacted by the light of Jesus Christ in 2023. We recently welcomed 8 new children into the family, and the Division of Family Services here has been begging us to take in more children.
And that was Executive Director of Niños, the former Executive Director, I should say, Steve Ross, speaking in 2023 in a message to a church in Oregon that was supporting Niños, like seemingly many, many church communities in Missouri and all over the country. Julie, that sound of Niños and Steve Ross, I can hear it. I can see it affecting both of you just listening to it. The sound of birds in the background, this vision of if you support what's happening here, you will be making a beautiful place even better. And he is saying this in 2023, right at the edge of the cliff, as these abuse cases are going to be public. At this point, you both have spoken to him directly about these cases, and he is still speaking to these church communities and presenting. Julie, you described a kind of Disneyland version. How do you explain that this could have been continuing so late and that this facade was still being propped up in a way that anyone listening to that, they would think this is a great thing to support? They would be devastated to know what was really happening. What do you hear in that clip?
Prototypical consistent messaging is what I hear. And I think that was his perspective. I think that he consistently over time chose to portray the ministry in a particular way, and that never deviated, ever, regardless of the reality of the situation. It was a constant denial, omission, downplay, and ignoring of the realities. And I think it's important to understand that you can have a community where there are horrific abuses occurring and there are children who did not have those abuses touch their lives. It's possible to have both of those realities reside in the same space. And so what I hear when I listen to that clip that absolutely repulses me is that he's choosing only to present the one-sided reality. And that's the reality that I bought and sold into. And it's the reality that people for decades, and when leadership was chosen, they chose leaders who were that prototype, who would be consistent with that messaging and would move and drive that agenda forward. And that has never changed to the day that they closed their doors.
Eric, in the introduction to the Grace Report that was released, right before Niños shuts down, the Grace Report actually includes an email that you had sent to Steve Ross in 2023, not perhaps around the time he would have made that kind of message. You write to him that saying essentially that this organization has been able to avoid consequences for so long that it's made it more reckless. And you quote Ecclesiastes, because the sentence for a crime is not handed down speedily, men's hearts are fully set on doing evil. What was in your mind as you wrote that message to Steve Ross at the precipice of this? And looking back on this report, did this play out the way you hoped it would?
What was in my mind when I wrote that email was I was going to see this through to the end, whatever it looked like. I understood that many people had done what I was doing, and that was speak out against organizations, religious and secular, with a variety of results. However, my convictions as a Christian and in my own walk with the Lord gave me confidence that this was going to turn out exactly how it did turn out, that this was different, that other people, like Julie said, had spoken out at different times, but that there was a convergence of factors that made this special, the connection between what we were doing in the States and the connection with what we were doing in Mexico, the constellation of stories that had been collected over the course of months before I went to the board of directors, and other factors. And there's another passage in Ecclesiastes that says where the Lord sends the prophet, this is a passage in Ezekiel, where the Lord sends the prophet Ezekiel to the people of Israel who are not listening to him. And he says, whether they listen or not, you are to speak my words. And that was my motto, whether the churches listen, whether Niños listens, whether the leadership listens, whether anybody listens, I'm going to speak this message because it's true and the children are worth it. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, and in this case it did work out.
I'm looking at the website for Niños de Mexico, and as I said, after the Grace Report came out in November of last year, Niños shuts down almost immediately, and now the only thing on this website that had once had many testimonials and photos and things is a pretty brief statement. They celebrate, first the work of the organization through 58 years. They thank their supporters of the ministry. They have a line that says, "As you may know, we have been waiting on the final results of an independent investigation from Grace. The investigation of our past practices and current systems was set in motion with the purpose of investigating to find truth and clarity surrounding allegations of abuse and other misconduct. That investigation is concluded. After reviewing the findings of this report, it is with a heavy heart that the Board of Niños de Mexico has decided to end our ongoing ministry effective immediately." There is really no other description in this statement about why, about what happens next, about why this report was even made. As we close this conversation, I'm wondering what you take from this final act of Niños to not acknowledge anything overtly, but just to close. And is there a next chapter here that you're looking for, or another step that has not yet been taken? Julie.
Well, Grace made recommendations, so they chose to close. And in my estimation, it was incredibly cowardly. And again, I can only speak to the leadership under which I served, tried to teach the children Christian principles. And if you look at the website and their responses, and I am speaking of the board and the leadership here, none of those have been modeled at all. No repentance, no acceptance of fault or guilt, no turning, no public apologies, no acknowledgement of the victims, no nothing. So when I read that, I thought, you can take the microphone and walk off the stage and say, "We're done." But that does not absolve you from any of the consequences that have been set into motion. So there would have been ways that they could have run this ministry in a godly manner. And with protocol, they had so much talent in that community. They had people with the hearts that loved those children. There were so many people who loved those children, who were there for the right reasons, who had the right skill sets, who had the right passion, who would not have done those things to the children. And those are the people, Eric and I talked about this one time, and they're the people that left. They're the people that were pushed out. And I would like to see a reckoning. And that reckoning involves restitution to the victims. It involves criminal prosecution. It involves them having to be accountable. And I'm talking about all of them being accountable to the victims and the survivors. I deeply grieve for the generations of children who now feel this deep sorrow over having lost the only place that they refer to as home and people that they referred to as family, who may now blame people like myself and Eric and other whistleblowers who spoke the truth about this because they don't have their home. But I won't accept that blame because it's the leadership's responsibility. It always was their responsibility. They were in the positions where they could have stopped this. At any point in time, they could have taken the road less traveled, and they took the road most traveled and protected the institution, and now they don't have an institution anymore. And they failed the name of Jesus Christ in doing so, and they failed their vulnerable population that they were charged to serve and protect, and that is solely on them.
Eric, you are still in touch with many of the folks connected to Niños. You have continued to write on the blog, which you began exposing this abuse. You have received direct allegations, in fact, about Steve Ross, and abuse that he allegedly committed. It seems like there is more still that has not been spoken, that has not been uncovered. You are just one person. Where do you hope to go from here as someone who has spoken out? And is there some other authority or some other group that you hope will come into this to continue to set things right?
So let me say a couple things. First, I have to take a stab at the question that you asked about the letter that Niños sent out.
Yeah.
That letter was a crystallization of everything that the whistleblowers years back had experienced: deceit, cowardice, and pride. What you will not find in that letter is what so many of us have felt, which is broken hearts, sleepless nights, and tears as we have thought about dear friends and loved ones who we went down there to support, who were violated in the worst ways possible. They couldn't even spare a "I'm sorry" in that letter. So if they're nothing else, they're consistent. But with regards to continuing on, and with me being one person, what do I want to do? I started speaking out after a teenage girl who had been abused in Niños went on her Facebook and wrote about going home every night to a monster. It was that teenage girl's bravery in speaking out in public about the most intimate and difficult kind of violation of a person's body and trust that made me think, if she's going to do it, how am I going to let her do it by herself? And we as a culture have watched as someone like Rachel Denholander has spoken out about the Larry Nassar case or Jerry Sandusky. And I have read these books and listened to these stories, each individuals, and been inspired to speak out and speak truth to power in my own community. And my hope is that if there's going to be an enduring legacy of this, the reason why I continue to talk about this is that I hope my story will do the same thing for somebody else, that they'll be able to see one voice, someone who's not a minister, who's not an official, who has no authority or power, speaking out and being able to affect a change.
That was Eric Miller and Julie Heifner, former volunteers and supporters of the Niños de México orphanage. They spoke with producer Danny Wicentowski last week about their experiences as whistleblowers and ways Niños drew support and funding from churches in Missouri and other states.
This episode was produced and edited by Danny Wicentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.